You know what the real problem with intergalactic conquest is these days? Market research. Nobody does their homework anymore. Take the Zephyrians, for instance. 8 feet of crystalline superiority wrapped in enough arrogance to choke a gas giant. They'd been steamrolling through the Outer Rim territories for the better part of a decade, collecting species like some cosmic kid with a bug net. And honestly, they were pretty good at it. The Altarians folded after 3 days. The Centaurian Republic lasted a whole week before surrendering. Even the notoriously stubborn vegan colonies threw in the towel after witnessing what happened to the last guy who said, "Come and take it." So when the Zephyrian Empire's long-range scouts detected a little blue-green marble orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, they figured it'd be just another Tuesday. The inhabitants called themselves humans, apparently, and from initial observations, they seemed about as threatening as a particularly aggressive houseplant. No energy shields, no plasma cannons. Hell, they were still using chemical propulsion to get off their own planet, assuming you could even call those primitive rockets propulsion. The Zephyrians had seen more advanced technology in their academy's remedial engineering courses. "This should be amusing," declared Fleet Commander Kex'tal, as he reviewed the intelligence reports from his flagship's command deck. The bridge crew, a collection of the Empire's finest military minds, each one capable of reducing a small moon to cosmic dust, nodded in agreement. Some even managed what passed for chuckles in their species, a sound somewhere between grinding glass and a dying turbine. The plan was elegantly simple, as all good plans should be. Drop a few ships into Earth's orbital space, maybe vaporize a major population center or two for emphasis, then sit back and wait for the inevitable surrender. They'd done it 100 times before across 100 different worlds. It was practically routine at this point. What they didn't account for, and really, how could they have known, was that humans are the galactic equivalent of that one friend who brings a knife to every situation, regardless of whether it calls for a knife. Wedding? Knife. Funeral? Knife. Tax audit? You better believe they've got a knife. The first sign something was off came when the Zephyrian advanced scouts tried to establish communication with what their sensors identified as the planet's primary governmental bodies. Instead of the usual trembling pleas for mercy, they received what one communications officer later described as an impressive variety of anatomically impossible suggestions. "Sir," reported Sub-Commander Kex'tal, his crystalline features flickering with confusion. "The humans are... well, they're not responding as expected." "Define not as expected," Kex'tal replied, though he had a sinking feeling he knew where this was going. "They told us to, and I'm translating loosely here, stick our demands where our digestive processing units don't function." Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated in irritation, a sound that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. "Did you explain that we possess the firepower to reduce their civilization to component atoms?" "Yes, sir. They asked if we needed directions to the nearest black hole to accomplish certain acts upon ourselves." Now, to be fair to the Zephyrians, this wasn't entirely unprecedented. Plenty of species had tried the defiant route initially. The trick was finding the right pressure point, threaten their young, destroy their cultural centers, demonstrate superior firepower in an appropriately terrifying manner. Standard Galactic Conquest 101. They started with Tokyo. Well, they tried to start with Tokyo. See, the thing about humans that the Zephyrians discovered roughly 30 seconds after their first attack run began is that humans have this peculiar habit of shooting back. Not with harsh language or diplomatic protests, actual honest-to-entropy shooting. "Sir!" Kex'tal's voice carried a note of panic that hadn't been there moments before. "The humans are launching projectiles at our attack craft." Projectiles. Kex'tal's tone suggested he found this about as threatening as being attacked with fruit. "Their primitive missiles won't even penetrate our deflector screens." "No, sir, not missiles. They're actually throwing things. Physical objects. At velocities approaching..." The sub-commander paused to double-check his readings. "Sir, they're throwing chunks of metal fast enough to damage our hulls." And that's when the Zephyrians learned their second important lesson about humans. They'd been watching too much of their entertainment broadcasts, and not nearly enough of their military exercises. Those primitive railguns the humans had been testing in their various armed forces? Turns out they worked just fine on crystalline armor plating. The first Zephyrian fighter craft to get swatted out of the sky by a magnetic accelerator cannon landed. Well, landed is probably too generous a term. Impacted would be more accurate, somewhere in the middle of downtown Denver. The pilot, a young warrior named Kex'tal, had the dubious honor of becoming the first member of his species to be captured by humans. Now Kex'tal was a professional, He'd been through all the standard prisoner of war training courses the Empire required. He knew the drill: maintain operational security, reveal nothing beyond name and rank, wait for rescue or an opportunity to escape. Standard stuff. What he hadn't been prepared for was being dragged out of his crashed fighter by a group of humans who seemed less interested in interrogation and more interested in... Well, honestly, he wasn't entirely sure what they were interested in. "Holy shit, look at this thing," said one of the humans, a tall, lanky specimen with prematurely graying hair and the kind of perpetual stubble that suggested either a very precise grooming routine or a complete lack of one. This was Dr. Richard Sterling, though Kex'tal wouldn't learn the human's designation until much later. "It's like someone crossed a praying mantis with a chandelier." "Can it understand us?" asked another human, this one shorter and stockier, with the kind of build that suggested either dedicated physical training or really good genetics. Or both. "Well," Sterling replied, crouching down to examine the crystalline pilot more closely. "It was flying something that looked suspiciously like a spacecraft, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably." Kex'tal decided this was as good a time as any to establish communication protocols. "I am Kex'tal of the Zephyrian Imperial Fleet. I demand to be treated according to the Galactic conventions governing prisoners of war." The humans exchanged glances. Sterling straightened up and scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Galactic conventions, huh?" he mused. "Well, here's the thing about that. We're not really signatories to any galactic conventions, on account of not having known there was a galaxy-spanning civilization until about 20 minutes ago. This was not going according to the manual. Furthermore," Sterling continued, warming to his subject, "I'm not entirely convinced you folks came here to discuss treaty negotiations." Kex'tal's thorax segments shifted in what was meant to be an intimidating display. "The Zephyrian Empire has conquered over 200 worlds. Your resistance is futile. Surrender now and your species will be permitted to exist as a client race under Imperial oversight." "Client race," Sterling repeated as if testing the words. "That's fancy talk for slavery, isn't it?" "It is a position of honor to serve the Empire." "Right." Sterling nodded slowly. "And if we decline this generous offer?" "Your world will be sterilized. Your species will be extinct within a solar rotation." Sterling looked around at his colleagues, then back at Kex'tal. "You know what? I think we're going to take door number 3. "There is no door number 3. "Sure there is." Sterling's grin was the kind that would have made a shark nervous. "Door number 3 is where we figure out how your ships work, reverse engineer your technology, and then come pay you folks a visit at home." Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated in what might have been amusement if you were feeling generous. "Your species barely comprehends the principles of interplanetary travel. You cannot possibly—" "Buddy," Sterling interrupted, "let me tell you a little something about humans. We're real good at 2 things, breaking stuff and figuring out how stuff works. Usually in that order. And that's when Kex'tal learned the 3rd important thing about humans. They meant every word of it. The next few hours were educational. For both species, really. But mostly for the Zephyrians, who suddenly found themselves in the unprecedented position of having their advanced combat vessels systematically disabled by a species that was still figuring out fusion power. See, the thing about humans, and this is something that apparently never made it into the Zephyrian intelligence reports, is that they have this wonderful combination of creativity, stubbornness, and just enough intelligence to be dangerous. It's like giving a loaded weapon to someone who's simultaneously an expert marksman and completely insane. The railgun attack on Tokyo had been just the beginning. Within hours, every major military installation on the planet was coordinating a response that was equal parts tactical genius and complete madness. "Sir," reported Vex Cole, his crystalline features now cycling through what could only be described as the visible spectrum of panic. "The humans have somehow managed to disable 3 more of our fighters." "How?" Kex'tal demanded. "Their weapons shouldn't be capable of—" "They're not using their weapons, sir. They're using everything else." "Explain." "Well, sir, one of our fighters was brought down by what appears to be a magnetic resonance imaging device that was recalibrated to function as an electromagnetic pulse generator." Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated slowly. "They turned their medical equipment into weapons?" "That's not the strange part, sir. The strange part is that they did it in under 2 hours, and now they're asking if we want to surrender." "They want us to surrender?" "Yes, sir. They also included a list of what they called terms and conditions, along with something called a warranty policy for our continued existence. This was definitely not in the manual. Meanwhile, back at the impromptu human research facility that had sprung up around Kex'tal's crash site, Dr. Sterling was having the time of his life. It had been years since he'd encountered a problem this interesting, and he was attacking it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning or finding a $20 bill in an old jacket. "So let me get this straight," he said, pacing around the restraint chair where Kex'tal was secured. "Your species travels faster than light by manipulating space-time distortions through controlled gravitational fields." "I will not divulge technical specifications to a primitive species," Kex'tal replied, though with considerably less conviction than he'd had a few hours earlier. "Oh, I'm not asking you to divulge anything," Sterling said cheerfully. "I'm telling you what we figured out from scanning your ship's drive system. Really elegant design, by the way. We're thinking of a few improvements, though." "Improvements?" Kex'tal couldn't quite keep the skepticism out of his voice. "Well, your power coupling system is decent, but you're losing about 12% efficiency through harmonic resonance in the field generators. Simple fix, really. You just need to adjust the phase variance by about—" "That is classified Imperial technology," Kex'tal interrupted, though he was beginning to suspect that this classification wasn't worth much at this point. "Not anymore, it isn't." Sterling grinned and held up a tablet displaying a three-dimensional schematic that looked suspiciously like the interior of Kex'tal's fighter. "We're fast learners." And that's when Kex'tal learned the fourth important thing about humans. They weren't kidding about being fast learners. By the end of the first day, human engineers had not only reverse-engineered the basic principles of Zephyrian faster-than-light travel, but they'd also identified 17 different ways to improve upon it. By the end of the second day, they'd built a working prototype. By the end of the third day, they'd weaponized it. "Sir," Vex'tal reported, and at this point his voice had taken on the quality of someone who was beginning to question some fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. "The humans have launched, something. Define something," Kex'tal said wearily. The past 72 hours had been the longest of his military career, and that included the siege of Proxima Centauri, which had lasted 6 months and involved actual siege warfare. "It appears to be a modified missile of some kind, sir. It's using a derivative of our own FTL technology, but they've somehow managed to make it faster than our fastest scouts." Kex'tal felt something that he was pretty sure was the beginning of a stress-related breakdown. "How much faster?" "Approximately 3 times faster, sir. And it appears to be heading directly for the Imperial shipyards at Zephyr Prime." There was a long moment of silence on the bridge, the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete mental collapse. "Sub-Commander Vex'tal," Kex'tal said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was trying very hard to remain professional, while experiencing what could only be described as an existential crisis. "Yes, sir." "Open a communication channel to the human leadership." "Sir, I believe it's time we discuss terms." Back on Earth, Dr. Sterling was enjoying what he'd later describe as the most interesting week of his career. The Zephyrian prisoner, who had proven to be surprisingly cooperative once he realized that human reverse engineering was less carefully studying and more dismantling everything to see how it worked than building something better, had provided enough information to advance human technology by roughly 1,000 years in under a week. "You realize," Kex'tal said during one of their increasingly cordial conversations, "that your species has just accomplished something that took the Empire centuries to develop." "Yeah, well," Sterling replied, making notes on a design schematic that would have made a Zephyrian engineer weep with either admiration or horror. "We're motivated learners. This is not normal behavior for a sentient species." Sterling looked up from his work. "Define normal." "Most species, when encountering advanced technology, attempt to understand it gradually. They study it, test it cautiously, implement small improvements over generations." "Sounds boring." "It is safe." "Also sounds boring." Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated in what Sterling had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a sigh. "Your species appears to have skipped several million years of normal technological development." "We're overachievers," Sterling said, then paused. "Also, somebody just tried to blow up our planet. Tends to focus the mind. The Empire has blown up many planets. This is not typically considered grounds for immediate technological revolution." "Yeah, well, we're not most species." And that, Kex'tal was beginning to realize, was something of an understatement. The communication from the human leadership came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been accessible to their technology, using an encryption protocol that shouldn't have existed in their culture, and with a video quality that was frankly better than the Empire's own communication systems. The human who appeared on the view screen was an older woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been dealing with difficult situations since before most of the bridge crew had been activated. Behind her, barely visible in the background, were displays showing what appeared to be real-time tactical information about the entire Zephyrian fleet. "I am President Elizabeth Harrison," the human said without preamble. "I believe you wanted to discuss terms." Kex'tal straightened in his command chair, trying to project the same authority that had served him well in 100 previous conquests. "I am Fleet Commander Kex'tal of the Zephyrian Empire." "I know who you are," Harrison interrupted. "I also know that approximately 6 hours ago, your homeworld's orbital defense network experienced what your military is probably calling a catastrophic systems failure. Would you like to know what we call it?" The bridge was silent. In the background, someone could be heard muttering what sounded like prayers to various Zephyrian deities. "A demonstration," Harrison continued. "We're not unreasonable people, Commander. We understand that this is probably all some sort of misunderstanding. Cultural differences, language barriers, that sort of thing." Yes, Kex'tal managed. "Perhaps there has been some confusion in our initial contact protocols." "I'm sure there has been. For instance, when you announced your intention to sterilize our planet, I'm sure you meant something much more friendly. Like sterilize in the sense of clean up, not kill everything that lives here." "Of course. The translation algorithms can be imprecise." "I understand completely. Just like how when we sent that little demonstration to your homeworld, we certainly didn't mean to disable your entire orbital defense grid and leave your planet completely defenseless to any follow-up attacks we might choose to launch." Kex'tal felt his thorax segments contracting in what his species considered a stress response. "Naturally, I am certain this was merely a technical malfunction." "Absolutely. Just like how the complete technical specifications for every ship in your fleet that we've somehow acquired are probably just the result of some sort of filing error." At this point, Kex'tal was beginning to suspect that he was in significantly more trouble than he'd initially thought. "President Harrison, I believe there may be an opportunity for our species to reach some form of mutual understanding." "I certainly hope so, Commander. After all, it would be a shame if this little misunderstanding escalated into something more serious." The way she said "more serious" made it sound like the kind of thing that involved the complete restructuring of galactic civilization, possibly with extreme prejudice. "What terms did you have in mind?" Kex'tal asked, and was mildly proud that his voice only shook a little. "Oh, nothing too complicated. Immediate cessation of all hostile activities against Earth and human interests. Complete withdrawal of all Zephyrian military assets from this system. And of course, full disclosure of the political and military structure of your empire, including the location and defensive capabilities of all major installations. That is, comprehensive. We're thorough people, Commander. We also have a few requests regarding technology sharing, cultural exchange programs, and what we're calling mutual defense agreements." Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated rapidly as he processed this. "And if we were to, hypothetically, decline these terms?" Harrison's smile was the kind that would have made a predatory fish proud. "Well, Commander, let me put it this way. That little demonstration we sent to your homeworld? That was what we built in 3 days using salvaged parts from one of your fighters." She paused to let that sink in. "We've been working on some improvements since then. Would you like a demonstration of version 2? The silence on the bridge was deafening. Finally, Kex'tal found his voice. "I believe version 1 was quite sufficient, thank you." "Excellent. I'm so glad we could reach an understanding. Oh, and Commander? Your pilot, Kex'tal, has been incredibly helpful. We'd like to offer him a position with our new Joint Research Initiative." "Joint Research Initiative?" "Oh yes. We're thinking of calling it the Galactic Technological Advancement and Definitely Not Conquest Program. Dr. Sterling seems to think your people might have some interesting insights to contribute." Back at the research facility, Dr. Sterling was having the conversation of his lifetime with someone who was beginning to understand that he'd just witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. "Your species," Kex'tal said slowly, "has just accomplished what the Empire would have considered impossible." "Which part?" Sterling asked, genuinely curious. "The reverse engineering, the improvements, or the whole negotiating from a position of strength after 3 days thing?" "All of it. Any of it. Take your pick." Sterling nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when your people first showed up here, I thought we were in pretty serious trouble." "You were. But then I realized something. You guys are basically running on the same principles that drove European colonialism back in the 15th through 19th centuries. Superior technology, superior firepower, and the assumption that anyone with inferior technology must also have inferior intelligence. This is not an inaccurate assessment." The thing is, we've been on both sides of that equation. We know what it's like to be the guys with the advanced technology rolling over everyone else. But we also know what it's like to be the underdogs who figure out how to fight back. Sterling leaned back in his chair. Your people have been the dominant force in this part of the galaxy for so long that you've forgotten what it's like to face real competition. We've never had the luxury of not having real competition. And now? Now you get to find out what happens when someone who's used to being the underdog suddenly has access to your technology. Plus a few hundred years of human innovation. Plus the kind of motivation that only comes from someone trying to wipe out your entire species. Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated slowly. This is going to change everything, isn't it? Oh yeah, Sterling grinned. Everything. 3 months later, the first human diplomatic mission arrived at Zephyr Prime, aboard a ship that utilized technology that was nominally Zephyrian in origin, but had been so heavily modified that it bore about as much resemblance to the original as a fighter jet bears to a paper airplane. The ship was also approximately twice as fast as anything in the Zephyrian fleet, armed with weapons that existed in a legal gray area somewhere between advanced military technology and crimes against physics, and was crewed by a species that had gone from primitive chemical rockets to galactic superpower in under 6 months. The Zephyrian Empire, which had spent the better part of the last decade perfecting the art of galactic conquest, suddenly found itself in the unprecedented position of hosting a diplomatic mission from a species that had somehow managed to reverse engineer their entire technological base and improve upon it while they weren't looking. President Harrison, who had decided that this was the kind of historic occasion that called for a personal appearance, arrived at the imperial capital with a delegation that included Dr. Sterling, 3 of Earth's top diplomatic negotiators, and a security detail that was armed with enough firepower to level a small continent. Just in case. President Harrison? Fleet Commander Kex'tal greeted her as she disembarked. Welcome to Zephyr Prime. Thank you, Commander. Lovely planet you have here. I particularly enjoyed the orbital defense network. Very impressive. Almost as impressive as the one we disabled 3 months ago. Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated in what might have been diplomatic acknowledgement or resigned acceptance. Yes, your demonstration was quite educational. We're teachers at heart, Harrison replied cheerfully. Always happy to share what we've learned. The negotiations that followed would later be studied in diplomatic academies across the galaxy as a masterclass in how to completely restructure the balance of galactic power, while maintaining the pretense that everyone involved was simply working out a few minor misunderstandings. The final agreement, which became known as the Treaty of Mutual Understanding and definitely not conquest, established several key principles. First, that the Zephyrian Empire would immediately cease all military expansion, and would transition to what the humans delicately termed a more collaborative approach to interspecies relations. Second, that all previously conquered species would be granted immediate independence and full membership in a new organization called the Galactic Federation of Definitely Independent and Not at All Conquered Worlds. Third, that the Zephyrian Empire would provide full technical assistance to any member world that requested it, particularly in the areas of defense against hypothetical future threats from aggressive spacefaring civilizations. And fourth, that humanity would take on the role of galactic peacekeeping coordinators, with full authority to intervene in any conflicts that might threaten the stability of the new order. The treaty was signed in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy, featuring representatives from over 200 previously conquered worlds, all of whom seemed surprisingly enthusiastic about this new arrangement. The Zephyrian leadership, for their part, signed the treaty with the kind of resigned dignity usually reserved for surrendering generals who were grateful to be allowed to keep their heads. And Dr. Sterling, who had been promoted to Director of Interspecies Technological Development, spent the ceremony trying not to grin too obviously as he watched the birth of what historians would later call the Human Galactic Peace Enforcement Initiative. You realize, Kex'tal said to him during the reception afterward, that your species has just become the dominant military power in known space. Dominant is such an ugly word, Sterling replied, sipping something that was either champagne or a mild industrial solvent. I prefer enthusiastically helpful. And the fact that you've essentially conquered the galaxy in under 6 months? Conquered? We haven't conquered anyone. We've liberated them. Completely different thing. Kex'tal's thoracic chambers vibrated in what Sterling had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of laughter. Of course, my mistake. Besides, Sterling continued, we're not conquerors. We're problem solvers. The galaxy had a problem with aggressive expansionist empires, and we solved it. By becoming the most aggressive expansionist empire in galactic history. No, we're not expansionist, we're protectors. We protect people from expansionist empires. It's a public service. And the fact that you've managed to acquire the military technology and strategic intelligence of every major power in the galaxy? That's just good planning. Can't protect people effectively without knowing what you're protecting them from. Kex'tal looked around the reception hall, where representatives from dozens of species were eagerly discussing technical cooperation agreements with human officials, while Zephyrian military officers stood around looking like they were still trying to figure out exactly what had happened to them. Your species, he said finally, is terrifying. Nah, Sterling replied. We're helpful. Helpfully terrifying, maybe, but definitely helpful. And that, as it turned out, was probably the most accurate description anyone would ever give of humanity's approach to galactic diplomacy. 6 months later, when the first edition of the Galactic Peace and Prosperity Report was published by the Human Diplomatic Corps, it would note with satisfaction that incidents of interspecies warfare had dropped by 97% since the implementation of the Treaty of Mutual Understanding and definitely not conquest. It did not mention that this was largely because every potential aggressor in the galaxy was now absolutely convinced that starting a war with anyone would result in a visit from the humans, who had developed something of a reputation for solving conflicts with what they called overwhelming humanitarian intervention. The report also noted a remarkable increase in technological advancement across member worlds, as human technical advisors worked tirelessly to help bring all civilizations up to minimum defensive standards, which coincidentally happened to be roughly equivalent to the military capabilities of the former Zephyrian Empire. And finally, the report expressed satisfaction with the establishment of the new Human Galactic Peace Enforcement Academy, where promising young beings from across the galaxy could learn the latest techniques in conflict resolution, negotiation, and rapid technological development in crisis situations. Dr. Sterling, who had been named the Academy's first director, was particularly proud of the curriculum, which emphasized practical problem-solving skills and what he called aggressive creativity in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The Academy's motto, suggested by Sterling and approved unanimously by the faculty, read simply, "There's always door number 3. Kex'tal, who had accepted a position as senior instructor in comparative galactic military history, would often use this motto as the starting point for his lectures on what he called the human approach to impossible problems. The thing about humans, he would tell his classes, is that they don't accept that problems are impossible. They just assume they haven't figured out the solution yet." He would pause here, letting his students absorb this concept. This makes them extremely dangerous to anyone who thinks they have an insurmountable advantage. Another pause. It also makes them extremely valuable allies, provided you're not trying to conquer them. And then he would smile, or at least perform the crystalline equivalent of a smile, and begin the day's lesson on how a species that had barely achieved interplanetary travel managed to become the dominant force in galactic civilization in under a year. The lessons were very popular. Almost as popular as the Academy's unofficial student handbook, which had been written by Dr. Sterling and was titled, "Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Humans But Are Probably Going to Find Out Anyway." The handbook's introduction began with what Sterling considered the most important piece of advice he could give to any non-human species. Humans are not normal. They are not typical. They are not what you expect from a sentient species. If you remember nothing else from this handbook, remember this. When dealing with humans, always assume that the impossible solution is not only possible, but probably already in development. The handbook was required reading for all diplomatic personnel throughout the galaxy, and at the end of each chapter, in small print that was easy to miss unless you were looking for it, was a simple reminder. The first human they captured was the last one they ever saw. Because as it turned out, capturing one human was easy. It was dealing with the other 8 billion that presented certain logistical challenges. End. Chapter 1. Universal Peace. My ass. So there I was, minding my own business aboard the UES Defiant. And yes, before you ask, some committee of military geniuses actually thought that name was intimidating rather than a desperate cry for attention, when the galaxy's most pretentious alliance decided to throw a little peace celebration party. The Galactic Concordat had just declared victory over the Zephyrian Empire after what they pompously called the War to End All Wars. Original title, really. I'm sure nobody's ever used that one before. The whole affair had lasted roughly 3 standard galactic years, which in Earth time translates to long enough for everyone to get really tired of shooting at each other. Commander Felix O'Brien, that's me, in case you were wondering, was currently stationed approximately 47 light-years from the nearest decent burger joint, watching alien diplomats pat themselves on the back through a live broadcast. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were celebrating the end of warfare while I sat in the command chair of humanity's most advanced warship, which they'd apparently forgotten existed. "Sir?" Lieutenant Davies called from the communications station, his voice carrying that particular blend of confusion and amusement that usually preceded something catastrophically stupid. "We're receiving a priority transmission from Concordat High Command." "Let me guess," I said, not bothering to look up from the tactical display showing absolutely nothing happening in our sector. "They want to thank us for our... what do they call it when they pretend we helped? Valuable contribution to galactic stability?" "Actually, sir," Davies grinned, "they're ordering us to stand down and return to Earth immediately. Apparently, our services are no longer required." I blinked. Once. Twice. Then I started laughing, because the alternative was probably some form of interstellar incident that would require paperwork. "They're dismissing us?" I asked, just to make sure I'd heard correctly. "The people who've been fighting this war for the better part of a decade are being told to go home because the grown-ups have sorted everything out?" "That appears to be the gist of it, sir. You see, here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy never quite grasped. We don't do dismissed very well. It's not in our nature. We're the species that looked at fire and thought, I bet I can make this burn hotter. We're the ones who invented warfare as a professional career choice, then got so good at it that we started hiring ourselves out as mercenaries to alien civilizations who'd barely figured out gunpowder. The Galactic Concordat had been more than happy to accept our help when the Zephyrian Empire started their little expansion project. Human military contractors were cheap, effective, and had this delightful tendency to solve problems with what our alien allies diplomatically termed creative violence. We'd spent years teaching various species the fine art of combined arms tactics, asymmetric warfare, and the theological significance of superior firepower. But now that the Zephyrians had apparently surrendered, news to me, considering nobody had bothered to inform the people actually doing the fighting, the Concordat figured they could just wave us off like we were some kind of interstellar pest control service. "Davies," I said, settling back into my command chair with the kind of smile that usually made junior officers nervous. "Get me a channel to Admiral Harrison back on Luna Base. And while you're at it, see if you can raise the other ships in our task force. I have a feeling they're getting similar orders." "Sir, if I may ask," Davies said carefully, "what exactly are you planning?" "Planning?" I laughed. "Kid, I'm not planning anything. But I've got a sneaking suspicion that this war isn't nearly as over as everyone thinks it is. And when it inevitably starts up again, I want to make sure we're in position to provide the galaxy with a proper demonstration of why you don't dismiss human forces while they're still armed and operational." Chapter 2. The Art of Being Ignored. Admiral Harrison's face appeared on the main viewer, looking like someone had just told him that his favorite restaurant had been converted into a tax office. His expression carried that particular blend of bureaucratic frustration and barely contained homicidal rage that senior military officers perfected after years of dealing with politicians. "O'Brien," he said without preamble, "please tell me you haven't started an interstellar incident in the last hour." "Not yet, sir," I replied cheerfully. "But the day is young and I've always been an optimist." "God damn it, Felix." Harrison rubbed his temples in the universal gesture of command officers everywhere. "I suppose you've received the Concordat's generous suggestion that we pack up our toys and go home?" "I have indeed. Very thoughtful of them to let us know our services are no longer required. I'm particularly impressed by their timing, dismissing us right before they hold their victory parade. It's like being fired from a construction job just before the ribbon-cutting ceremony." "The situation is complex," Harrison said, which in military speak usually meant politically fucked beyond all recognition. "The Concordat negotiated a ceasefire with the Zephyrian Empire 3 days ago. Apparently there was some kind of breakthrough in diplomatic channels." "A breakthrough," I repeated slowly. "Sir, with all due respect, the Zephyrians have been expanding aggressively across 17 star systems. Their entire military doctrine is based on the principle that might makes right, and their diplomatic corps consists mainly of people who collect the heads of negotiating partners as trophies. What kind of breakthrough convinces them to suddenly embrace peace and universal brotherhood?" "The kind," Harrison said grimly, "where they agree to a temporary cessation of hostilities in exchange for territorial concessions that include most of the systems they've already conquered." I stared at the screen for a moment, processing this information. So let me get this straight. The Concordat's big victory consists of officially giving the Zephyrians everything they've already taken by force, in exchange for a promise to stop taking more. That's a rather cynical way of putting it. Sir, I'm a career military officer who's spent the last 8 years fighting in a war that apparently ended without anyone bothering to inform the enemy. Cynical doesn't begin to cover my current emotional state. Harrison sighed, and I could see the weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders like a particularly heavy blanket made of bureaucratic stupidity. Felix, I need you to understand something. The Concordat isn't just dismissing human forces because they think the war is over. They're dismissing us because we've become politically inconvenient. Our casualty rates are too low, our success rate is too high, and our methods make the other species nervous. Ah, I said, the pieces clicking into place. We're making them look bad. Worse, we're making them look incompetent. When human tactical advisors can turn a species' entire military around in 6 months, it raises uncomfortable questions about how they've been fighting wars for the last few centuries. This was unfortunately not a new problem. Humans had a disturbing tendency to revolutionize whatever field we entered, usually by applying what we considered common sense, and everyone else considered revolutionary thinking. We'd accidentally reinvented 3 different species' understanding of physics, improved their agricultural yields by several 100%, and generally made ourselves indispensable in all the wrong ways. So, I said, what are our orders? Officially? Pack up and go home. Take our ships, our weapons, our tactical innovations, and our inconveniently effective military doctrine back to Earth where we can't embarrass anyone. And unofficially? Harrison's smile was the kind that usually preceded career-defining decisions that would either result in commendations or court-martials, with very little middle ground. Unofficially, Commander O'Brien, I'm ordering you to conduct extended patrol operations in the Outer Rim territories. Standard reconnaissance protocols, maintaining communication silence except for scheduled check-ins. Your mission parameters are deliberately vague, which should give you considerable operational flexibility. Translation: go find trouble, and when you do, make sure you're in position to remind everyone why dismissing human military forces might not have been the smartest decision the Concordat ever made. Understood, sir, I said. And if we happen to encounter Zephyrian forces who didn't get the memo about this ceasefire? Then you're authorized to defend yourself with appropriate force. And Felix? Our definition of appropriate has always been somewhat more generous than most species. Chapter 3. Redefining Appropriate Force. The UES Defiant wasn't the largest ship in the human fleet, but she was definitely the meanest. While other species built their warships to look impressive, all sweeping curves and aesthetic flourishes that served no practical purpose, we'd designed ours with the single-minded focus of a species that had spent most of its evolutionary history trying to kill things more efficiently. She was a block of tungsten steel alloy wrapped around the most advanced weapon systems human engineering could produce. With enough armor to shrug off a tactical nuclear strike and enough firepower to sterilize a small moon. The aliens called our ship designs aggressively utilitarian, which we took as a compliment. Currently, that aggressive utilitarianism was cruising through the Kepler 442 system at a leisurely pace, conducting what the official logs would show as routine patrol operations, and what any reasonable observer would recognize as looking for someone to fight. Lieutenant Commander Wright, my executive officer, was a woman who'd earned her position by being simultaneously brilliant, completely unflappable, and just cynical enough to appreciate the absurdity of our current situation. She was currently reviewing intelligence reports with the kind of expression usually reserved for people trying to solve calculus problems while being attacked by wasps. "Sir," she said, not looking up from her datapad, "I'm reading some interesting traffic intercepts from the Zephyrian communication networks." "Define interesting," I said, though I was already pretty sure I knew what she was going to tell me. "Well, it seems that roughly 60% of their fleet commanders haven't received any orders about a ceasefire. In fact, based on these intercepts, most of them are still operating under their original expansion directives." "Shocking," I said, with all the surprise of someone who'd just discovered that water was wet. It's almost as if a militant empire built on conquest and territorial expansion might have some communication issues when it comes to suddenly embracing peaceful coexistence. "It gets better," Wright continued with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from being proven right about something terrible. "Intelligence indicates that at least 3 Zephyrian battle groups are currently moving toward Concordat systems that were supposedly guaranteed protection under the ceasefire agreement. And I suppose the Concordat is handling this development with their usual level of decisive action and clear thinking?" They're calling it a minor administrative oversight and requesting that the Zephyrian High Command issue clarifying orders to their field commanders. I stared at her for a moment, trying to process the sheer bureaucratic optimism required to believe that a species whose idea of diplomacy involved the phrase, submit or be annihilated, would suddenly develop an interest in proper administrative procedures. Right, I said finally. Remind me why we're not running the galaxy yet. Because we're apparently too competent to be trusted with the responsibility, sir. Right. Well, in that case, let's see what this minor administrative oversight looks like up close. Set course for the Proxima Centauri system. If my memory serves, that's where Zephyrian Battlegroup Sigma was last reported, and it's also home to about 3 million concordate civilians who are probably operating under the charming assumption that they're no longer in a war zone. Sir, said Davies from his communications station, aren't we supposed to be maintaining communications silence? Davies, my boy, I said, settling into my command chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just found a perfectly legitimate excuse to do something monumentally stupid. We're conducting extended reconnaissance operations. How are we supposed to reconnaissance anything if we're not in position to observe potential threats to concordate security? And if we encounter hostile forces? Then we'll defend ourselves with appropriate force, exactly as ordered. The fact that our definition of appropriate might differ somewhat from the concordates is really more of a cultural misunderstanding than a violation of orders. Chapter 4. Cultural Misunderstandings. The Proxima Centauri system turned out to be a textbook example of why you shouldn't trust interstellar ceasefires negotiated by people who've never actually met the enemy in person. 3 Zephyrian heavy cruisers were currently orbiting the system's primary inhabited world, which I was pretty sure violated at least 17 different articles of whatever peace agreement the Concordat had supposedly negotiated. Sir, Wright reported, sensors are detecting weapons charging sequences aboard the Zephyrian vessels. They're preparing to bombard the planetary surface. Well, I said, that certainly seems like aggressive behavior for ships that are supposed to be honoring a ceasefire. I suppose we should introduce ourselves and ask them about their intentions. Sir, we're outnumbered 3-1, and those are heavy cruisers. Each one outguns us by a significant margin. Right? I said patiently. You're thinking like a concordate military officer. You're assuming that because the enemy has larger ships and more firepower, they have some kind of tactical advantage. Don't they, sir? Only if you fight the kind of war they're expecting. Davies, open a channel to the lead Zephyrian vessel. Let's see if we can resolve this diplomatically before we're forced to educate them about human military doctrine. The alien captain who appeared on the main viewer was a classic example of Zephyrian military architecture, about 7 feet tall, covered in what looked like natural armor plating, and possessed of enough redundant vital organs that shooting him once would be considered more of a suggestion than a solution. He was also wearing the kind of expression that suggested he found human existence personally offensive. "Human vessel," he growled in accented Standard Galactic, "you will withdraw immediately from this system. We have claimed it in the name of the Zephyrian Empire." "I'm sorry," I said with the kind of polite confusion usually reserved for customer service interactions. "But I think there might be some confusion here. According to my information, your government recently agreed to a ceasefire with the Galactic Concordat. Doesn't bombarding civilian populations violate the terms of that agreement?" The Zephyrian captain made a sound that was probably laughter but sounded more like a garbage disposal trying to eat a motorcycle. "The weak-minded fools of the Concordat agreed to surrender territory that was already ours by right of conquest. This ceasefire merely formalizes what we have already taken. These humans are under our protection now." "Ah," I said, "I see the misunderstanding. You see, Captain? Battle Leader Vorthak of the 3rd Assault Fleet." "Right, Battle Leader Vorthak. The thing is, those aren't just any humans down there. Those are Earth citizens, under the protection of the United Earth Defense Forces. And we have a somewhat different perspective on the whole protection concept than your people do." Vorthak's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been quite so terrifying. "1 small human ship against 3 battle cruisers? You amuse me, little primate. Perhaps I will make your death quick as a reward for your courage." "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "But I think you might be operating under a slight tactical misconception. You see, you're not facing 1 small human ship. You're facing a human ship with a very specific set of design parameters, commanded by officers who've spent the better part of a decade learning how to kill things more efficiently than nature intended." I turned to Wright. "Commander, please demonstrate the appropriate level of force for a situation where 3 hostile vessels are threatening Earth civilians." Wright's smile was the kind that usually preceded engineering marvels that violated several laws of physics and at least 1 treaty governing the conduct of interstellar warfare. With pleasure, sir. All weapons, target the lead cruiser, fire. Chapter 5. Applied Mathematics. Here's the thing about human military engineering that the rest of the galaxy never quite appreciated. We didn't build our weapons to look impressive. We built them to solve problems with extreme prejudice and mathematical precision. The Defiance primary armament consisted of 6 particle beam projectors, each one capable of delivering roughly the same amount of focused energy as a small star. When all 6 fired simultaneously, the result was less like a weapon and more like a localized violation of the laws of thermodynamics. Battle leader Vorthak's flagship simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. One moment it was a 2-kilometer-long testament to Zephyrian military engineering, and the next it was a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated plasma that lit up the system's inner planets like a particularly violent sunrise. The silence on the communications channel was profound. Huh, I said, studying the tactical display with the kind of academic interest usually reserved for particularly fascinating physics experiments. That was more effective than our simulations predicted. Right, make a note to recalibrate our targeting systems. I think we might have been slightly conservative in our power estimates. Sir, Wright replied, her voice carrying the sort of professional satisfaction that came from watching theoretical mathematics become practical results. Sensors indicate that the remaining Zephyrian vessels are powering down their weapons and attempting to withdraw from the system. How rude, I said. Here we were just starting to get acquainted. Davies, open a channel to the remaining ships. The Zephyrian who appeared on the screen this time looked considerably less confident than his predecessor. In fact, he looked like someone who'd just witnessed something that violated several fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Human vessel, he said, his voice carrying the sort of careful politeness usually reserved for conversations with heavily armed psychopaths. We withdraw our claim on this system. There has been a misunderstanding. Oh, I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all, I replied cheerfully. You came here to bombard a planet full of civilians, and we came here to stop you. The mathematics worked out exactly as expected. But since you mention it, I'm curious about something. Didn't your government agree to a ceasefire with the Concordat? We were not informed of any such agreement. Really? That seems like the sort of thing you'd want to communicate to your field commanders. Administrative oversight, perhaps. The alien's expression suggested that he was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going to end the way he'd originally hoped. Perhaps, he said carefully, there has been some confusion in our command structure. Perhaps there has, I agreed. Tell you what, Captain. Why don't you return to your superiors and suggest that they clarify their position on this whole ceasefire situation? And while you're at it, you might want to mention that Earth forces are still active in this sector and taking a very personal interest in the welfare of human civilians. And if we encounter other administrative oversights, then you'll discover that human military doctrine is quite generous when it comes to interpreting our defensive responsibilities. We have a saying, proportional response is for people who can't do math properly. The Zephyrian ships withdrew with the kind of haste usually associated with natural disasters or tax audits. Within 20 minutes, they were beyond sensor range, and presumably transmitting very urgent messages to whoever was supposed to be coordinating their empire's newfound commitment to peace and universal brotherhood. Sir, Davies said, we're receiving a priority transmission from the planetary government. They're asking if we need anything. Food, fuel, shore leave, naming rights to their firstborn children. The usual. Gratitude is always nice, I said, but what we really need is information. Have them send up their intelligence files on recent Zephyrian fleet movements. If this was an administrative oversight, I want to know how many other oversights we might expect to encounter. And if it wasn't an oversight? Wright asked. Then we're about to become very popular with the Concordat leadership, right up until they realize that we've just turned their carefully negotiated ceasefire into the opening act of a much more interesting war. Chapter 6. Administrative Nightmares. The intelligence reports from Proxima Centauri made for fascinating reading, assuming your definition of fascinating included phrases like systematic violation of interstellar law and imminent threat to galactic stability. It turned out that Vorthak's battle group hadn't been an isolated case of poor communication. The Zephyrian Empire was conducting what they diplomatically termed security operations throughout at least 12 systems that were supposedly under Concordat protection. Sir, Wright said, reviewing the data with the sort of expression usually associated with people discovering that their house was on fire. It looks like the Zephyrians never had any intention of honoring the ceasefire. This whole thing was a delaying tactic while they repositioned their forces for a major offensive. Shocking, I said. though I was beginning to suspect that the situation was even worse than it appeared. I suppose the Concordat's intelligence services completely missed this development. According to these reports, Concordat forces have been systematically withdrawn from forward positions as part of the peace dividend. Most of their advanced warning systems have been deactivated, and their rapid response capabilities have been reassigned to ceremonial duties. I stared at the tactical display, watching the little red icons that represented Zephyrian battle groups moving through space like a particularly aggressive rash spreading across the galaxy's arm. The Concordat had essentially disarmed themselves at the precise moment their enemies were preparing for the largest military operation in galactic history. Right, I said finally. In your professional opinion, how long do we have before the Zephyrians launch their main offensive? Based on their current fleet movements and logistical requirements, maybe 72 hours, sir. And how long will it take the Concordat to remobilize their forces once they realize what's happening? Assuming they believe the intelligence reports and don't spend 6 months forming committees to study the situation, 2 to 3 weeks, minimum. So we're looking at a scenario where the Zephyrians achieve complete tactical surprise against an essentially defenseless enemy, occupy another 20 or 30 star systems, and present the galaxy with a fait accompli before anyone can mount an effective response. That appears to be the plan, sir. I leaned back in my command chair and considered our options. On one hand, we'd been officially dismissed from this conflict and ordered to return to Earth. On the other hand, we were career military officers who'd just discovered that several million civilians were about to become casualties in a war that everyone thought was over. Davies, I said, get me Admiral Harrison on a secure channel. And while you're at it, see if you can raise the other ships in our task force. I have a feeling we're about to redefine the concept of operational independence. Harrison's face appeared on the screen, looking like someone who'd spent the last several hours receiving exactly the sort of intelligence reports that made career military officers question their faith in the basic competence of civilian leadership. O'Brien, he said without preamble, please tell me you have some good news. Well, sir, we've successfully demonstrated that Zephyrian heavy cruisers are significantly less durable than their manufacturers advertise. Does that count? Jesus Christ, Felix. What did you do? We encountered what appeared to be a minor administrative oversight and corrected it with appropriate force. The locals were very grateful. Harrison rubbed his temples with the sort of weary resignation that came from years of dealing with subordinates who had a talent for turning simple reconnaissance missions into interstellar incidents. And I suppose this administrative oversight involved Zephyrian forces violating the ceasefire? Among other things, sir. It turns out that the ceasefire might not be quite as comprehensive as the Concordat leadership believes. We're looking at what appears to be systematic preparations for a major offensive operation. I transmitted the intelligence data and watched Harrison's expression evolve from resignation to alarm to the sort of grim determination that usually preceded career-defining decisions. How many ships do we have in the Outer Rim? He asked finally. The Defiant, the Retribution, the Indomitable, and the Righteous Fury. 4 ships total, with full combat loads and experienced crews. Against how many Zephyrian battle groups? Current intelligence suggests somewhere between 15 and 20, sir. So we're outnumbered roughly 60 to 1, assuming their intelligence estimates are accurate. And you're requesting permission to engage? Sir, I said, I'm requesting clarification of our mission parameters. If we're supposed to be conducting extended reconnaissance operations, then we need to be in position to observe and report on Zephyrian military activities. If those activities include aggressive action against Concordat civilians, then our defensive responsibilities seem fairly clear. Harrison stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see him calculating the political ramifications of what I was suggesting. On one hand, we'd been explicitly dismissed from this conflict. On the other hand, we were about to watch the largest military disaster in galactic history unfold, while we had the power to prevent it. Felix, he said finally, I'm going to give you the most dangerous order I've ever issued. You are authorized to use your best judgment in protecting Concordat civilians from hostile action. Your operational parameters are limited only by your ammunition supply and your crew's endurance. Understood, sir, and if the Concordat leadership objects to our continued involvement? Harrison's smile was the sort that usually preceded the kind of historical footnotes that began with phrases like, against all odds, and ended with, massive casualties on both sides. Then they can file a formal complaint after we've finished saving their asses. Chapter 7. Against all odds. The thing about being outnumbered 60 to 1 is that traditional military tactics become somewhat irrelevant. You can't establish a defensive line when the enemy has enough ships to surround you 12 different ways. You can't conduct a fighting withdrawal when there's nowhere to withdraw to. And you definitely can't win a stand-up battle when the other side can afford to lose 50 ships for every one of yours and still come out ahead. Fortunately, humans had never been particularly interested in traditional military tactics. "All right, people," I announced to the combined crews of our little task force via encrypted communications. "Let's review our tactical situation. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without official support in a hostile region of space. The enemy has superior numbers, better logistics, and home field advantage." "Sir," came Wright's voice over the channel, "you're supposed to be giving us a motivational speech. This sounds more like a suicide note." "I'm getting to the good part," I replied. "The Zephyrians are expecting to fight a conventional war against conventional opponents using conventional tactics. They're planning to mass their forces, overwhelm fixed defenses, and occupy territory through superior firepower and numerical advantage. And that's good because we're not conventional opponents and we're not going to fight a conventional war. We're going to remind the galaxy why human military doctrine is based on the principle that if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough." The plan, such as it was, relied on several fundamental advantages that human forces enjoyed over their alien counterparts. First, we were faster. Human ships were built for speed and maneuverability, rather than impressive appearances or defensive capability. Second, we were more aggressive. While other species viewed warfare as a series of carefully planned engagements, humans treated it as organized violence with a tactical component. Third, and most importantly, we were completely unpredictable. The Zephyrians were expecting their enemies to form battle lines, establish defensive positions, and conduct orderly retreats when overwhelmed. They were not expecting their enemies to split into individual units, attack from 17 different directions simultaneously, and treat the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute requirements. "Right," I said. "Take the Retribution and the Indomitable and hit their supply lines. I want their logistics network disrupted, their communication relays destroyed, and their command structure wondering what the hell just happened to them." "Sir, that's going to require attacking targets deep behind enemy lines." "Exactly. The Zephyrians have committed most of their forces to their main offensive. Their rear areas are probably defended by whatever they consider second-line units. Show them why that was a tactical error. And what will you and the Fury be doing? We're going to attack their main battle group directly and see how they react when someone shoots back." There was a moment of silence on the communications channel. "Sir," said Commander Reynolds from the Righteous Fury, "just to be clear, you're planning to attack their main force with 2 ships. "Reynolds, my boy," I said, "you're thinking like someone who believes in fair fights. We're not trying to destroy their entire fleet in a single engagement. We're trying to convince them that continuing this offensive is going to be significantly more expensive than they originally calculated." Chapter 8. Applied Psychology. The Zephyrian main battle group was an impressive sight. I'll give them that. 43 heavy warships arranged in a classic conquest formation, moving through space with the kind of inexorable certainty that came from believing you were the biggest predator in the galaxy. Their formation was textbook perfect. Their coordination was flawless, and their tactical doctrine was probably studied in military academies across a dozen star systems. It was also completely useless against opponents who didn't read the same textbooks. "Davies," I said, studying the tactical display with the sort of professional appreciation usually reserved for particularly elegant mathematical proofs. "What's the maximum effective range on their primary weapons?" "Approximately 40,000 kilometers, sir. Standard particle beam projectors with focusing arrays optimized for ship-to-ship combat." "And our maximum effective range?" 120,000 kilometers with the new targeting systems, sir." "Outstanding. Reynolds, are you seeing this?" "I see it, Commander. They've arranged themselves in a perfect target formation. It's almost artistic." "Artistic is right. They're so busy looking impressive that they've forgotten the first rule of space combat. The side that shoots first usually wins. Let's give them a practical demonstration of human gunnery." The opening salvo from the Defiant and the Righteous Fury caught the Zephyrian formation completely off guard. 6 ships simply vanished in brilliant flashes of light. Their hulls turned to superheated plasma before their crews had time to realize they were under attack. The remaining ships immediately began evasive maneuvers, but they were trying to dodge weapons that moved at nearly the speed of light while flying in formation designed for impressive parades rather than tactical flexibility. "Sir," Reynolds reported, "enemy formation is breaking up. They're attempting to close range and engage us directly." "Let them come," I said. "Davies, plot a course that keeps us at maximum weapons range. We're not trying to win a decisive battle here. We're trying to make them chase us while Wright hits their supply lines." "Sir, they're launching fighters." "How many?" Roughly 300, sir. I paused for a moment, considering this development. Fighter craft were one of those tactical innovations that looked impressive on paper, but had some significant limitations in practice. They were fast, maneuverable, and capable of overwhelming larger ships through sheer numbers. They were also completely unarmored, lightly armed, and dependent on their carriers for fuel, ammunition, and life support. Reynolds, I said, remember those new point defense systems we've been field testing? The ones that intelligence said were probably overkill for any realistic combat scenario? Those would be the ones. Let's see how they perform against a target-rich environment. The Zephyrian fighters came in fast and hard, probably expecting to overwhelm our defensive systems through numerical superiority. It was a sound tactical theory that might even have worked against conventional opponents. Unfortunately for them, human point defense systems were designed by a species that had spent considerable time thinking about the most efficient ways to shoot down large numbers of small, fast-moving targets. The result was less like a space battle, and more like someone had decided to demonstrate the principles of industrial automation using military hardware. Automated tracking systems identified targets, calculated intercept courses, and fired with mechanical precision. The fighters didn't so much get shot down as processed, turned into scrap metal by systems that treated incoming missiles and enemy fighters as essentially the same type of problem requiring the same solution. Sir, Davies reported, enemy fighter strength is down to approximately 30% and decreasing rapidly. Outstanding. And their main battle group? Still pursuing, but they're having trouble maintaining formation at these speeds. Several ships have fallen behind, and their targeting systems don't appear to be optimized for long-range engagement. Perfect. Keep us at maximum range and maintain fire. Let's see how long they're willing to chase us while taking casualties. The answer, it turned out, was not very long. After losing 18 ships to weapons they couldn't effectively return fire against, while watching their fighter screen get systematically dismantled by point defense systems that treated military aircraft like particularly aggressive insects, the Zephyrian commander apparently decided that this wasn't the sort of easy victory he'd been promised. Sir, enemy forces are withdrawing, Davies announced. All of them? Yes, sir. They're returning to their original formation and moving back toward their home territory. I stared at the tactical display, watching the red icons representing enemy ships retreat with the kind of haste usually associated with people who'd just discovered that their opponents cheated better than they did. Right, I called over the communication system. How are you making out with their supply lines? Spectacularly, sir. We've destroyed 4 logistics bases, knocked out their primary communication relay, and convinced 3 supply convoys that they'd rather be somewhere else. Their rear areas are in complete chaos. Any casualties on our side? Minor damage to the Indomitable's port shields, and Reynolds reports that the Fury is down to about 60% ammunition. Other than that, we're fully operational. Outstanding. Davies, open a channel to the Zephyrian command ship. I think it's time we had a diplomatic conversation about the nature of administrative oversights. Chapter 9. Diplomatic Solutions. The Zephyrian fleet commander who appeared on the main viewer looked like someone who'd just been forced to recalculate several fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. His armor was scorched, his expression was grim, and his body language suggested that he was having the sort of day that usually ended with early retirement or court-martial proceedings. Human commander, he said, his voice carrying the sort of careful respect usually reserved for conversations with natural disasters. I am War Leader Kex'tal of the Imperial 7th Fleet. We underestimated your capabilities. War Leader, I replied with the kind of polite professionalism that came from being raised to respect one's elders, even when those elders had just spent several hours trying to kill you. I'm Commander O'Brien of the United Earth Defense Forces, and I think there might be some confusion about our current tactical situation. Confusion? Kex'tal's expression suggested that he thought he had a fairly clear understanding of exactly how badly things had gone wrong. Well, yes. You see, according to my information, your government recently agreed to a ceasefire with the Galactic Concordat. Yet here you are, conducting military operations in systems that are supposedly under Concordat protection. I'm starting to wonder if there might be some communication issues in your command structure. Kex'tal was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing his options. He could continue the deception and pretend this was all a misunderstanding, or he could acknowledge the reality that his carefully planned surprise offensive had just run headfirst into the sort of opposition that military planners usually classified as acts of God. Commander O'Brien, he said finally, perhaps we should discuss terms. Terms? I asked, raising an eyebrow. War Leader, I'm not sure what terms you think are available, Your forces violated a ceasefire agreement, attempted to bombard civilian populations, and engaged Earth defense forces in hostile action. In most jurisdictions, that's called acts of war. What do you want? Now that was an interesting question. What did I want? Officially, I wanted Zephyrian forces to honor their ceasefire agreement and withdraw from Concordat territory. Unofficially, I wanted to make sure that this particular tactical lesson made its way up the Zephyrian command structure to whoever had thought that dismissing human military forces was a good idea. What I want, I said, is very simple. I want you to return to your home territory and inform your superiors that the ceasefire agreement they negotiated is still in effect. I want you to explain to them that Earth defense forces are still operational in this sector and will continue to take a personal interest in the welfare of human civilians. And I want you to make sure they understand that any future administrative oversights will be corrected with appropriate force. And if we refuse? I smiled, and apparently it was the sort of smile that conveyed exactly how I felt about people who threaten civilians under my protection. War leader, I said gently, you just lost 18 ships to a force 1/4 your size. Your supply lines are in ruins, your communication network has been compromised, and your fighter screens have been essentially eliminated. If you refuse, you'll discover that what just happened to you was actually us being diplomatic. Krethax stared at me for a long moment, probably calculating the odds of successfully continuing his offensive against opponents who had just redefined his understanding of tactical probability. We will convey your message to our superiors, he said finally. Excellent. Oh, and war leader? When you're explaining this situation to your command structure, you might want to mention that we're just a small reconnaissance force. The rest of the Earth Defense Fleet is considerably less diplomatically inclined than we are. The Zephyrian fleet withdrew with the sort of haste usually associated with tactical retreats that had been planned by people who suddenly remembered they had pressing appointments elsewhere. Within 6 hours, they were beyond sensor range and presumably transmitting urgent messages to their home government about the need to reconsider their recent strategic decisions. Sir, Wright said, we're receiving a priority transmission from Concordat High Command. They're asking what the hell just happened out here. Tell them, I said, that we encountered some minor administrative oversights and corrected them in accordance with our operational parameters. Also mention that we're continuing our extended reconnaissance mission and will report any further oversights as they develop. And if they order us to stand down, then we'll remind them that we're operating under direct orders from Earth Defense Command to protect human civilians from hostile action. I believe Admiral Harrison was quite specific about our authority in that regard. Chapter 10. Bureaucratic Consequences. The fallout from our little diplomatic intervention was swift, predictable, and utterly hilarious. Within 12 hours, every major news network in Concordat space was broadcasting breathless reports about renewed Zephyrian aggression and heroic Earth defense forces preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. The political establishment, which had spent the last week congratulating itself on negotiating a lasting peace, was suddenly faced with the uncomfortable reality that their enemies had never intended to honor their agreements. The Concordat Council's emergency session was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of bureaucratic panic. They'd dismissed human forces as politically inconvenient, only to discover that those same forces were the only thing standing between them and a military disaster of unprecedented proportions. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma sword. Sir, Davies reported, we're receiving multiple priority transmissions from Concordat leadership. They're requesting immediate clarification of our operational status, mission parameters, and authority to engage hostile forces. How many requests? 47 so far, sir, and counting. Any of them offering to reinstate our contracts? Not yet, sir. Though there are several messages that could be interpreted as subtle hints in that direction. I leaned back in my command chair and considered our position. On one hand, we'd just prevented what would have been the largest military disaster in galactic history. On the other hand, we'd done it after being officially dismissed from the conflict by people who were now trying to figure out how to ask us to come back without admitting they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Right, I said. What's our current tactical situation? 4 ships, full combat capability, operating independently in hostile territory. Intelligence suggests that Zephyrian forces are regrouping for another offensive, but they're being considerably more cautious about their approach. We've also received unofficial support offers from several Concordat member species who are apparently less concerned about political protocol than their leadership. And our supply situation? Adequate for extended operations, assuming we can arrange resupply through unofficial channels. The colonial governments are being very generous with their logistics support. Outstanding. Davies, prepare a response to Concordat High Command. Tell them that Earth Defense Forces are continuing their reconnaissance mission in accordance with our orders from Admiral Harrison. Mention that we've identified significant threats to civilian populations and are taking appropriate protective measures. And make sure to include a detailed report on Zephyrian force movements and tactical capabilities. Sir, that's going to make them very uncomfortable. They'll have to acknowledge that their intelligence services completely missed a major military buildup. Davies, my boy, I said. Making people uncomfortable is one of humanity's greatest diplomatic talents. If they're going to dismiss us and then expect us to bail them out of their mistakes, they can at least have the courtesy to be embarrassed about it. The response from Concordat leadership was swift and predictably bureaucratic. They couldn't officially reinstate human contracts without admitting that dismissing us had been a mistake. They couldn't officially authorize our continued operations without acknowledging that their ceasefire agreement was worthless. And they couldn't officially ask us to leave without taking responsibility for whatever happened to the civilian populations we were protecting. So they did what bureaucrats always do when faced with impossible political situations. They formed a committee to study the problem. Sir, Wright said, reviewing the latest communiques with the sort of expression usually reserved for people watching train wrecks in slow motion. The Concordat Council has established a special committee on irregular military operations to evaluate the current tactical situation and recommend appropriate policy responses. How long do they estimate this evaluation will take? 6 to 8 weeks, assuming they don't encounter any procedural complications. And how long do we estimate before the Zephyrians launch their next offensive? Based on current intelligence, maybe 10 days. Possibly less if they decide to accelerate their timeline. I stared at the tactical display, watching the red icons representing Zephyrian battle groups slowly maneuvering into position for what was obviously going to be another attempt at conquest through superior firepower. The Concordat was going to spend 2 months forming committees while their enemies spent 2 weeks preparing to overrun another dozen star systems. Right, I said. Get me Admiral Harrison on a secure channel. I think it's time we discussed the finer points of operational independence. Harrison's face appeared on the viewer looking like someone who'd spent the last several hours fielding communications from politicians who suddenly remembered why they'd hired human military contractors in the first place. "O'Brien," he said, "I take it you've seen the news reports about your little reconnaissance mission." "I have indeed, sir. Apparently, preventing humanitarian catastrophes is considered newsworthy in this part of the galaxy. Felix, I've got half the Concordat Council demanding that we recall our forces immediately, and the other half begging us to reinstate our military contracts. Any suggestions on how to handle this delicate political situation?" "Well, sir," I said, "we could always remind them that we're not actually operating under Concordat authority anymore. We're conducting independent operations in accordance with our responsibilities to protect Earth citizens and allied populations from hostile action." "Independent operations? Exactly. The Concordat dismissed us, remember? That means we're no longer bound by their political considerations or operational limitations. We're free agents, operating under Earth authority in defense of human interests and universal humanitarian principles." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications of what I was suggesting. "Felix," he said finally, "are you proposing that we conduct military operations without official Concordat authorization?" "Sir, I'm proposing that we continue to do exactly what we've been doing, protecting civilian populations from aggressive military action by hostile forces. The fact that this coincides with Concordat security interests is really more of a happy coincidence than an official policy coordination. And if the Zephyrians object to our continued interference in their expansion plans, then they'll discover that Earth Defense Forces have very definite opinions about the proper conduct of interstellar warfare. And unlike the Concordat, we don't require committee approval to express those opinions with appropriate force." Chapter 11. Express Delivery. The second Zephyrian offensive was larger, better coordinated, and considerably more cautious than their first attempt. Instead of massing their forces for a decisive blow, they divided their fleet into multiple battle groups and planned simultaneous attacks on 6 different systems. It was actually a fairly sophisticated tactical approach that demonstrated they'd learned from their previous encounter with human military doctrine. Unfortunately for them, they'd learned the wrong lessons. "Sir," Wright reported, "sensors are detecting Zephyrian fleet movements in sectors 7, 12, 15, 18, 21, and 24. They're positioning for coordinated strikes on major population centers." "How many ships total?" "Approximately 75 heavy warships, plus support vessels and fighter screens." They've divided into 6 battle groups of roughly 12 ships each, and they're probably expecting us to divide our forces to match their deployment, I said, studying the tactical display with the sort of professional appreciation reserved for opponents who'd put genuine effort into their planning. Classic multiple threat scenario. Force the defenders to spread thin and defeat them in detail. It's actually a sound tactical approach, sir. Against conventional forces, it would probably be quite effective. Right, I said. Remind me why we're not conventional forces. Because we cheat, sir. Exactly. Davies, get me the other ships on a secured channel. It's time we demonstrated why human military doctrine is based on the principle that if you're not violating at least 3 laws of physics, you're not trying hard enough. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which is generally the hallmark of ideas that are either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of dividing our forces to match the Zephyrian deployment, we were going to hit all 6 battle groups simultaneously using tactics that most military theorists would classify as physically impossible. All right, people, I announced to the combined task force. Here's how this is going to work. Each ship takes 2 targets. We're going to use our speed advantage to engage multiple battle groups in rapid sequence, hitting them before they can coordinate a response or call for reinforcement. Sir, Commander Reynolds asked, just to be clear, you're planning to attack 12 ships with 1? Reynolds, I said patiently, you're thinking like someone who believes in fair fights. We're not trying to destroy every enemy ship in a prolonged engagement. We're trying to inflict maximum casualties in minimum time, then move to the next target before they can figure out what hit them, and if they manage to coordinate their response. Then we'll remind them why human ships are built for speed rather than impressive appearances. The attack began at 0347 Standard Galactic Time, when 4 Earth defense vessels simultaneously engaged 6 separate Zephyrian battle groups across a volume of space roughly equivalent to a small solar system. The opening salvos were timed to arrive within microseconds of each other, creating the impression that the Zephyrians were facing a much larger force than actually existed. From the Zephyrian perspective, it must have seemed like the galaxy had suddenly developed a severe case of hostile human warships. One moment they were conducting orderly approach maneuvers toward their targets, and the next they were taking fire from weapons that shouldn't have been able to reach them from directions that shouldn't have contained enemy forces. Sir, initial strike successful, Wright reported. Enemy battle group Alpha has lost 4 ships, Bravo has lost 3, and Charlie is down to half strength. They're attempting to form defensive formations. Outstanding. Time to next engagement? 17 minutes to reach battle group Delta, sir. Perfect. That should give them just enough time to get comfortable before we arrive to ruin their day. The beauty of the plan was that it exploited the fundamental limitation of large military formations. They were designed to fight other large military formations in predictable engagements. When faced with small, fast-moving forces that attacked from unexpected directions and disappeared before effective counterfire could be coordinated, even the most sophisticated tactical doctrine became essentially useless. By the time the Zephyrian commanders realized they were facing a coordinated attack by the same 4 ships they'd encountered before, we'd already destroyed or damaged nearly 30 of their vessels, and moved on to targets they didn't even know we'd identified. Sir, Davies called from the communications station, we're intercepting Zephyrian fleet communications. They're having some difficulty coordinating their response. Define difficulty, I said, though the tactical display was already providing a fairly comprehensive answer to that question. They appear to believe they're under attack by a significantly larger force. Current intelligence estimates suggest they think we've deployed at least 20 ships in this operation. And what are they doing about it? Battle groups Echo and Foxtrot are withdrawing to defensive positions. The remaining groups are requesting reinforcement and attempting to coordinate a counterattack against targets they can't locate. I smiled, watching the red icons on the tactical display mill around in the sort of confused patterns usually associated with people who'd just discovered that their opponents didn't play by the rules they'd memorized. Right, I said. How many ships have we actually destroyed so far? 26 confirmed kills, sir. 14 more with significant damage that will require extended repair periods. Enemy combat effectiveness is down to approximately 40% of original strength. And our casualties? Minor damage to the Indomitable's starboard sensor array, and the Retribution reports they're down to about 30% ammunition. Other than that, we're fully operational. Outstanding. Davies, open a channel to the senior Zephyrian commander. I think it's time for another diplomatic conversation. Chapter 12. Terms of Surrender. The Zephyrian admiral who appeared on the main viewer looked like someone who'd just been forced to explain to his superiors why his carefully planned military operation had turned into what military historians would probably classify as An unmitigated disaster. His armor was damaged, his expression was grim, and his body language suggested that he was having the sort of career-ending day that usually resulted in early retirement or traditional warrior suicides. "Human Commander," he said, his voice carrying the sort of weary resignation usually reserved for people who'd just discovered that their retirement plans had been cancelled. "I am Fleet Admiral Morvac of the Imperial War Council. We wish to discuss terms." "Terms?" I asked, raising an eyebrow with the sort of polite surprise usually reserved for unexpected dinner invitations. "Admiral, I'm not sure what terms you think are available. Your forces have violated a ceasefire agreement for the second time in less than a week, attempted to bombard civilian populations, and engaged Earth defense forces in hostile action. Again, what do you want from us?" That was, I had to admit, an excellent question. What did I want from them? Officially, I wanted them to honor their ceasefire agreement and withdraw from Concordat territory. Unofficially, I wanted to make sure this particular lesson in tactical reality made its way to every military planner in the Zephyrian Empire. "What I want," I said, "is actually quite reasonable. I want you to return to your home territory and inform your government that their ceasefire agreement with the Concordat is still in effect and will remain in effect until officially terminated through proper diplomatic channels. I want you to explain to them that Earth Defense Forces will continue to operate in this sector under our humanitarian protection mandate. And I want you to make absolutely certain they understand that any future military operations in Concordat space will be met with appropriate defensive measures. And what assurance do we have that you won't attack our forces if we withdraw?" "Admiral," I said, "we're not interested in conquering your territory or occupying your worlds. We're interested in protecting civilian populations from aggressive military action. If your forces aren't conducting aggressive military actions, then we have no reason to shoot at them. What about compensation for our losses?" I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the sheer audacity required to ask for compensation after conducting unprovoked attacks on civilian populations. "Admiral," I said finally, "let me explain something about human military doctrine. When someone attacks civilian populations under our protection, we don't pay them compensation for the privilege of stopping them. We consider it a public service. Then what incentive do we have to accept your terms?" "Well," I said, "you could consider the alternative. You've lost approximately 30 ships in 2 separate engagements with a force that consists of 4 vessels. Your tactical doctrine has been proven inadequate, your technological advantages have been neutralized, and your numerical superiority has been rendered irrelevant. If you don't accept these terms, you'll discover that what we've done to you so far was actually us being polite." Morvac was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating the odds of successfully continuing military operations against opponents who had just redefined his understanding of tactical mathematics. "And if our government refuses to honor the ceasefire agreement? Then your government will discover that Earth Defense Forces have very strong opinions about the proper conduct of interstellar relations. And unlike the Concordat Council, we don't require committee approval to express those opinions with overwhelming force." The Zephyrian fleet withdrawal was, by all accounts, one of the most orderly tactical retreats in galactic history. Every ship that could still maintain propulsion departed the theater with the sort of haste usually associated with natural disasters or tax investigations. Within 18 hours, they were beyond sensor range, and presumably transmitting very urgent messages to their home government about the need to reconsider their recent foreign policy decisions. "Sir," Davies reported, "we're receiving priority transmissions from 17 different Concordat member governments. They're all expressing gratitude for our protection of their civilian populations and requesting continued Earth Defense Force presence in their territories. Any word from Concordat High Command?" "Nothing official, sir, though we have received several informal communications that could be interpreted as cautiously optimistic about our continued operations." "And the Special Committee on Irregular Military Operations?" "Still meeting, sir. Current estimates suggest they'll have preliminary recommendations ready in about 6 weeks. I leaned back in my command chair and considered our tactical situation. We'd successfully prevented 2 major Zephyrian offensives, demonstrated the superiority of human military doctrine, and provided the galaxy with a practical lesson in why dismissing competent military forces during an active conflict might not be the smartest decision ever made. More importantly, we'd reminded everyone involved that sometimes the best way to ensure peace was to make war sufficiently expensive that nobody wanted to pay for it. "Right," I said. "What's our current operational status?" 4 ships, full combat capability, operating independently with the gratitude of half the galaxy and the nervous respect of the other half. We've also received unofficial supply and logistics support from colonial governments throughout the sector. And our ammunition situation? Adequate for continued operations, assuming we don't run into anything larger than a major fleet engagement. Outstanding. Davies, prepare a message to Admiral Harrison. Tell him that our extended reconnaissance mission has identified and neutralized significant threats to civilian populations, and that we're continuing patrol operations to ensure regional stability. And if Concordat High Command objects to our continued presence, then they can explain to their constituent governments why they're more concerned about bureaucratic protocol than civilian protection. I suspect that conversation won't go the way they expect. Epilogue. Mission accomplished. 6 months later, the Galactic Concordat officially requested the reinstatement of human military contracts, with significantly improved terms and considerably more operational independence than our previous agreements. The Special Committee on Irregular Military Operations issued a report concluding that Earth Defense Forces had acted with exemplary professionalism in protecting civilian populations during a period of administrative uncertainty. The Zephyrian Empire, meanwhile, had undergone what their historians would diplomatically term a strategic re-evaluation of territorial expansion policies. Their new foreign minister was a remarkably reasonable individual who seemed genuinely interested in negotiating lasting peace agreements that didn't require immediate military enforcement. As for the UES Defiant and her sister ships, we continued our extended patrol operations with the sort of quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. We'd reminded the galaxy that dismissing competent military forces during an active conflict was generally a bad idea, that peace agreements were only as good as the people willing to enforce them, and that sometimes the most effective diplomacy was conducted with overwhelming firepower and a willingness to use it. "Sir," Wright said, reviewing our latest intelligence reports, "sensors are detecting some unusual activity in the Vega sector. Looks like pirates have been hitting merchant convoys near the trade routes." "Pirates?" I asked, settling into my command chair with the sort of anticipation usually reserved for people who'd just discovered new opportunities for professional development. "How many ships are we talking about?" "Intelligence estimates suggest at least a dozen raider vessels, possibly more. They've been targeting civilian cargo haulers and passenger transports." "Well," I said, "I suppose we should investigate. After all, protecting civilian shipping falls under our humanitarian protection mandate." "Sir, the pirates are probably using light raiders and converted merchant vessels. They won't be expecting to face military-grade opposition." "Right," I said. "That sounds like their problem, not ours. Davies, set course for the Vega sector. Let's go explain to some pirates why attacking civilian vessels in our operational area might not have been their best career decision." The UES Defiant turned toward the Vega sector with the sort of purposeful determination that had become humanity's signature contribution to galactic peace and stability. Behind us, the galaxy continued its long, slow process of learning that some problems were best solved by people who understood the therapeutic value of applied violence and weren't afraid to provide it in generous doses. And somewhere in the depths of space, a new group of people was about to discover why human military doctrine was based on the principle that if you were going to do something, you might as well do it properly. The war, as it turned out, wasn't over after all. It was just getting started,